Just need to cool down a bit.
Do you want us to? Me and Leon can be on the side as well.
Thanks.
We should start like this, by the way, because why not?
Yeah.
Just be really authentic.
Welcome to the Fighting Dementia Podcast, a helpful resource for families facing dementia. Episode 1, Stephen's Journey.
Welcome to the Fighting Dementia Podcast, a series that's dedicated to exploring the complex world of dementia, the impact that it has on individuals, on families and on carers. I'm your host Stephen, and in this episode I'm actually going to be the guest so that you can hear a little bit more about my story and why I'm directly interested in this topic. Dementia is an umbrella term that covers a multitude of different memory conditions, and it's estimated there's about 55 million people globally that are directly impacted by it. So it's quite likely that you or a family member or friend have had an experience with the disease. One of the things that we want to do with the podcast is look at different coping mechanisms, technologies that are out there to help, strategies to make it easier to live with the disease and enable the person with dementia to live a full, fulfilling life and not be constrained. As we go into the podcast now, we look forward to hearing your feedback. We want to hear more about topics that you want to hear about, so please do post comments and we look forward to reading those. We hope you enjoy the podcast and find it helpful.
Welcome to the first episode of Fighting Dementia Podcast, where we'll be piecing together knowledge and support for families going through dementia and their loved ones. My name's Mim, I'm the host of the show, so I'm really excited to be a part of it and learn from all of the guests that we're going to have on board. Today we have Leon Rossiter with us, who is CEO and co-founder of Leaf AI. So Leon, tell us why we're here.
Yeah, so we're here because we, actually started about 8 or 9 years ago now. My dad turned 70, had realised he lived a very interesting life. Every time I was seeing him, he was telling us a new story about flying over dips in Porsches and playing football in New Zealand, the top level, and thought, because I've got a son who's now 12 years old, how are we going to capture all of these stories and memories and pass it on to my lad and future generations. And so I'd worked in technology and started companies and stuff, so we built a product that was called Leaf, and it was a little tablet computer, and we ran our own software on there, and it asked people, who are a bit older about their life, their stories, their memories, so that we could basically turn those answers into a book about their life, which we thought was a nice idea. We got quite far with it, we gave it to a lot of people, and it turns out people don't want to sit there and type about their life story. Because it's quite boring. So went on that journey, learnt that, and then done a few other businesses with my co-founder Adam. And last year we were talking about AI and a lot of the stuff that's now possible with AI, and we thought that we could actually do Leaf by having the AI could have conversations with someone about their life. We could piece their stories together, and that might be an interesting experience, much better than sort of sitting there and typing it. Unfortunately, Adam's nan was diagnosed with dementia in the later years of her life, and he'd learned and been through that whole journey, which was awful. And he'd learned about reminiscence therapy, which is a therapy that's proven to slow down the disease progression, improve cognitive function, enhance emotional well-being, but it's not really delivered. It's either very expensive, sort of £50 per session, or informal carers or former carers don't have the time to sit there and reminisce with people, because you'd have to be doing it quite regularly to make an impact. So that's really how we started the company last year, was looking at how we can do reminiscence therapy using AI, and since then we've gone on sort of a journey with care organisations and getting our tech into there. We've learnt a lot, and we're just about to launch a product that's really centred on the families and the loved one who's been diagnosed with dementia, to help them tell their life story, to connect with family in more meaningful ways, to reminisce, to do all sorts of different bits and bobs, because we know what it's like in terms of journey. So yeah, I'm here today guest presenting, because we've got our regular presenter Stephen with us, and unfortunately he's been touched by dementia in his family. I met Stephen coaching my lads' footy team together, because we've got lads who are the same age, which has been a nice journey for a few years. Lots of ups and downs, mostly downs, unfortunately.
Yeah. Ups now though, right?
A couple of ups actually, actually some ups this season, which is cool.
Not so much last weekend.
We won't talk about last weekend. And Stephen's here really to tell us about your journey and how you've been helping us also in the company in the last few months, learnt about what we're doing, and because dementia had affected you, which you'll tell us about, that's kind of why you're going to be our first guest today, to sort of introduce you and your story.
Yeah, thanks, Leon. So, really excited to be here, excited to be involved in presenting the podcast as we go and being a guest today. So my story is, I've for the last 16, 17 years, I've worked for a company that, one of the biggest companies that does clinical research, so sort of know about running clinical trials and developing medicines and that space. But over the last, I think it's probably about 14, 15 years ago, we first started to suspect that my mum might be suffering with dementia. And we went through a diagnosis journey. We can talk about later maybe about how that went. And then probably about 6 or 7 years ago with my dad, similar sort of thing, started to think that he might have some memory issues as well. So we've been through a whole journey, which is, I think, is for anyone that's been through that, either as an individual with dementia or family supporting, each individual family will have their own story. So I can talk about our experience and what we've been through and learned along that journey, and then I think it'll be fascinating as we're talking to different people through the podcast to hear their experiences as well. And then hopefully, certainly I'm excited to hear from experts in the field who are working either researching dementia, researching ways to support people with dementia or their families, to really learn a lot from that as well. So.
And I know you'd mentioned about sort of support tools, like even we plan to get on people who are maybe legal or financial planning experts, and I know you were excited to I can get some free advice.
Yeah, I think if we can, because there's a lot of things that you just don't realise you need to know about when you're starting the journey, and certainly things like financial advice, legal advice, those kinds of things are some things that you need to think about and decide whether to actually invest in that or just investigate it yourself.
There's lots of cost implications, isn't there? But in terms of your journey, obviously you said that it started 13 years ago. I mean, what was your journey with both of your parents? Because they've both been diagnosed now. Like, what does that look like in the timeline in terms of from when you've had those initial kind of thoughts and concerns to when the diagnosis kind of happened? Like, what was that journey and what did it look like?
It's quite a long journey, really. So we lived in America for about 3 years with my job, and some family friends called us while we were there to express a few concerns about my mum, that they thought she was starting to have some memory issues. I think she'd got lost a couple of times and was maybe repeating things a little bit. And there were just some things that were indicating to them that there might be some issues. And then when she and my dad came to visit us, we noticed a few things as well, but not so significant that it was a definite, but there were just a few signs that maybe there was a problem there. We came back to the UK, and so at that time we suggested to my mum and dad that she went and got checked out. She went to the doctors, I think, fairly soon after that, and got an all clear from the doctor. And that's one of the things that we've certainly observed. And I think the diagnostic tools are starting to get better, and there's certainly a lot of research going on into how to diagnose dementia at a much earlier stage. But up until very recently, the tools have been very, very raw and basic. So you go to the GP, they'll have a chat about the symptoms you're seeing. You do a test. You basically run through a few questions. It might be, I'll tell you a few bits of information. I want you to remember it, and then I'll ask you about it a bit later on in the conversation. And then you might be asked questions about like some topical events, and then there'd be a score that would come out of that. And if you score above a certain number, you're not classified as having dementia. If you score below, you need further investigation. Right. But essentially, if you've started off at quite a high functioning level, so my mum was, done a degree, was a social worker, was really, very intelligent, very social, very articulate. So for years she could still pass that test without any issue. So even though we could see a big decline in her functioning, it took probably, I think it was about 5 or 6 years from that first, us observing symptoms through to the point of her actually being able to get a diagnosis of dementia. It might have been even
5 or
slightly
6
longer
years,
than that.
yeah. Wow.
Yeah, it was at least 5 or 6 years. It might have even been 7 or 8. I can't remember exactly when the diagnosis was. No. So.
Wow.
That must have been so frustrating, for constantly having to go back to the doctors, I'm assuming, to kind of get those checks again and again and pushing for more answers, I suppose, because that's what you're always looking for, isn't it? It's not necessarily, you are looking for a diagnosis, but the real thing is those answers to all of your questions. Yeah,
and for us, I think it was as well, because my mum didn't necessarily recognise the problems herself at the time. So it's like she went to the doctor says I'm fine, everything's fine. So it was more trying to work with my mum to get her to recognise that there were issues, and it was probably only when we got that final diagnosis, I think, that she was willing to properly recognise it, and even at that point struggled with it quite a bit. So it wasn't even necessarily going back to the doctor all the time, it was just a line was drawn under it and you didn't talk about it anymore.
So in that, because we've been around different early onset groups, different charities, different events that we've been invited to, Everton in the community especially, and spoken to a lot of informal carers, and I've heard that story a lot, where it's years where the wife or the husband or the son or the daughter does know that there's something seriously wrong, but then that person is either in denial or doesn't want to admit it or doesn't want to engage with it. That must be really difficult, and that's lasted for years for you. So I suppose, to other families out there and in that period, have you got any advice, having gone through it, things you might have done differently, things that you would do again, like in that phase? Because I can't even imagine how you handle it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that I've got a great answer on that, really, because it depends so much on how the individual themselves is responding to the situation as well. And that's part of the thing with dementia, is it stops your brain from seeing it, because you don't realise you've forgotten something, or you don't know that you've gone the wrong way in the car, or you might suddenly realise, but you just think, just took a wrong turn or something.
Yeah.
I think trying to be as open as possible in the communications, and if you're really concerned as a family, maybe try and find a way to sit down as a family where different people can say what they're seeing. But it's hard because you're also very aware of how it's making, I was very aware of how it was making my mum feel, and even when we got the diagnosis, it's not which direction dementia is going to go in, so it's not a positive thing. It can be quite a scary thing for the individual and the family to think about where that disease journey is going to go. So it's not always easy to have those conversations in families, is it? But I think the more that you can try and have that conversation and sit down as early as possible to be as open as possible about it, the better.
In terms of those, talking to the family members, how's it been kind of managing everyone's reactions? Because I can imagine it's so different across the whole of the family, including your mum and your dad's. What's that been like in terms of family life? How's that dynamic changed? Or, have you come together, or is it kind of shifted a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm one of 4 boys, so I've got three brothers. I'm the oldest, and I think in some ways it's brought us a bit closer together. We actually communicated about it pretty well, and we're fortunate or blessed that there's not really any conflict there about how we should deal with the situation. We're all very aligned. I'm the only one that's based in Liverpool, local to my parents. The others are a couple in London, one in Dubai. So it's us that are dealing with us locally that are dealing with the day-to-day situation most of the time, and they'll always listen to if we say we think we need to do something or other, they'll always be supportive of that. So that's been really good. I think one of the things that we've certainly found hard for a while was the perception, so relationships with the broader community, so my parents' friends in particular, who would often have a perspective on what we should be doing as a family or how we should be dealing with the situation.
Oh wow.
some of it not even necessarily vocalised, but you're just aware of sort of maybe reading between the lines a little bit of what people say or what they're indicating. You know, they'd feel that we should be doing more, or but not necessarily understanding the process that we'd had to go through, or where mum and dad were at, or just some of the difficulty of that. So I think that for a while we found that quite hard to just know how to navigate that. And then we just thought, actually, we just need to communicate as much as possible with people about what so that they understand where we're at on the journey and why. And they may agree or disagree, but at least it's then an open conversation rather than them thinking something and us feeling aware of that. And then,
because those friends might see them and catch them on a really good day.
That's right.
And walk away and think, what's all this about?
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with them.
Yeah.
I guess that might have happened.
Or the other way, it was probably more the opposite direction, where they'd think, you know, even recently we've had friends saying, my mum just moved into a nursing home week before last. But up until a couple of months before, she was in hospital for a bit before that, and then before that she was living at home still. And all the advice we were getting from professionals was they're both still in the right place. But some of their friends thought they should be moving into a home. So again, you're just trying to navigate that. So it's tended to be more friends would think we should have gone further with sort of forcing support almost.
Right.
It's so difficult, isn't it? It's not, because you're doing everything you can to support your parents, support your family as well. Yeah. Because we all know what happens with dementia, but then to also have to manage those other friendships and relationships that you don't always think about that with someone who has a diagnosis. You don't think about the extended connections and how that can impact your journey.
Yeah, it's complex, and particularly because you know, every type of disease has its own complexities, its own challenges, doesn't it? So it's not like dementia's got a monopoly on difficult situations, but I think the things that are particularly difficult for dementia are that the individual's capability can fluctuate quite a bit as well. So on one day, 1 week, they might be able to do something, and then another day, another week, they might not. And that might be a progression. Or it might be a blip. You know, one week they couldn't do, you know, they get lost. My dad went missing about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we had to get the police out. But he's not done that before. He's not done it since. So you can't necessarily. You almost have to be constantly aware of what the situation is, where it is right now, but also recognising where it is today may not be representative of even a trajectory necessarily. And I think that makes it complex for broader relationships as well, because to your point, Leon, people might see a particular view on the situation, or they might see a particular period of time or an event and then draw conclusions from that, whereas we're having to try and navigate the broader situation and what the implications are, and what's right. An added complexity for us and for some other families was that both my parents had dementia, so and at different stages, so a lot of the systems are set up with the assumption that the main carer is able to communicate with the care system, or whereas for my dad it became increasingly obvious that wasn't, we couldn't rely on him to do that. So
because through all of the research we've been looking at, it seems like social interaction and social isolation can sometimes be a trigger. It sounds like on your journey it would have been impossible if there wasn't proximity to the loved one. So is that, because I know families can be spread out all over the show, certainly in my family that's the case. Is that something that families would probably need to think about in terms of, if they saw that this was a potential, then they're going to have to strongly think about proximity in terms of to the loved one?
It definitely helps if you're nearby, and each family has their own situations. I've got a work colleague who's Australian and her mum's in a care home, but she's living in the UK. So she's having to manage that situation from a distance, and lots of people do that. And I think in some ways the care system, the social care system, and NHS kick in different ways depending on who's local. So we've not been through the experience of not being local and how that's dealt with, but I think there's different additional support that would come into play if there's nobody around.
That makes
it's
sense.
just handled differently. So I don't know. I think that would add challenges to the situation. But I don't know exactly what that would look like because we've been able to be local. So.
But from your understanding, it's sort of manageable situation because the health system would be able to step in with more support than if they know there's people around it.
Yeah, there's an assumption, quite rightly, that if there's family local, that they're taking a role in that and responsibility in that. But if not, there's also, I think the system relies on there being friends as much as possible as well, or other people that will step in as well. Yeah. So I think if you're fully isolated, it's probably not a great setup.
And since you saw, even 14, 15 years ago before the diagnosis, what are some of the resources either in the community or in general or groups or anything online that you've come across that has been helpful in the journey?
I think it's probably two aspects to that. One would be thinking about my parents and specifically in their situation, and some of that support has kicked in over time as their disease has progressed. So there's community, I think they're called Dementia Navigators, or there's a dementia service that will come out, visit people in the home, see how things are getting on, try and signpost to other resources that might be there. But it depends then on how willing, like my mum and dad didn't really want to engage with groups that they could go to or things like that, because they didn't really feel the need for that at the time, even though it might well have been really helpful. And at that point we were a bit outside the situation looking in because they were still managing it themselves. So I think there's probably more resources out there than my parents tapped into. And then as the disease has progressed, there's things like dementia day centres. My dad started going to a dementia day centre, which has actually been brilliant. And that was something we only found out about very recently. And we weren't sure if he would like that, but he's actually really, really enjoys it and seems to really benefit from it.
Yeah.
What kind of activities does he get up to there, do you know?
I think they do all sorts, like quizzes, which seems strange for people with dementia, but they seem to really like quizzes, bingo, raffles, singing, I think some craft stuff. So a lot of quite interactive things. We went to visit a different day centre, not the one that my dad goes to, but one that's run by the council. And the staff there seemed absolutely fantastic, and they were doing things like painting and it's almost like primary school type activities,
right?
That are not complicated and but very engaging and very bring energy and try and get people keep people's brains engaged, keep people energized.
And he seems to take away something, or he comes away in a positive manner in terms of energy wise.
And it's hard to
really
pinpoint,
nice.
but it seems like my dad seems a bit better and a bit more engaged since he's been going to that for the last
And it
month
sounds
or so.
like that was something you wish you'd found sooner. Is that right?
Yeah, it would have been good to know about it sooner. Again, it's hard to know whether my mum and dad would have gone at that point anyway, but definitely it's been really beneficial.
Right.
It's been good.
Would you say that's, because I know how I found with my sister, she had some troubles and stuff, and navigating the health system when big things happen, especially it seems to be mental health, can be quite challenging. Do you think that's something that is difficult, because there's just so much noise, isn't there, with social media and marketing, and it seems like quite a struggle for health systems and what's available to get their message out there to the right, and GPs stretched, all of that type of stuff. I don't even know if I've got a question, but it's more like
I think I know what you're getting to there. It's kind of like, is if someone else was going into this journey and they potentially are also going to come up against those challenges of maybe not having information signposted to them, like, what would you like to see in the future for those families? You know, like, and you're still going through your journey, so it, you know, hopefully there's more information out there for you. But like, yeah, what would you like to see for people who are starting their journey and, you know, looking for that information just to help them, or those resources just to guide them and signpost different community support networks and all of that?
Yeah, I think, so there's some resources available from like Alzheimer's UK or Dementia, is it Dementia UK? There's different groups that are providing information, which is really great, and some of the social care groups provide information as well. But I think you don't necessarily pick up on all of that at the time. There's quite a lot to think about, and often you just, certainly we found we're quite focused on just the immediate support needs and what you need at that particular point in time. So what certainly we found, as we've needed to engage more with the NHS and with social care, it's not always explained particularly well. And my wife's the GP, you know, I've been involved in clinical research. We're both, you know, in principle should be well equipped to engage with the system, but still found it very confusing at times. And there's a lot of assumption about what you should know. So the professionals that are involved in it day to day are dealing with this day in, day out. But I think it's not always recognised that you're dealing with this for the first time, and you don't know all the terminology, you don't know what to expect, you don't know just how to engage with the system. Yeah. And I think that would be something I would love to see more of, and hopefully that's one of the things we want to try and do with this podcast is try and just open up a bit more of that to people, to just some of the basics around how you know, what some of the things you might face as you go through this journey. So as an example, Mum's been in hospital until she moved into the nursing home. She was in hospital for about 7 or 8 weeks on a what they call a re-enablement ward, because she had a fall, not serious, fortunately. She was on a ward with some people who had dementia, but some who were, I think, mentally well but needed physical support. But the system doesn't really seem to be set up for communicating with families of people in hospital, explaining the situation. So even basic things like, we suddenly discovered there was a bag with some of her washing by the side of the bed that we were supposed to know we were supposed to have taken home and done the washing and brought it back. Or there's lots of different people, and the ward were fantastic. The staff on the ward were absolutely brilliant, lovely, and great for my mum. But when you go into the ward, you don't know who should I be talking to if I've got a question about something. What's the different roles of the people in the ward? How do we even get information about what's going on with mum, unless you happen to be there at a time where you see somebody who is involved? So that, you know, we saw the doctor a couple of times, and if you request, you can meet with them. But sometimes we'd ask, because some of it for my mum was about rehabilitation, you're trying to work out who you need to speak to about that and what the process is. And once she's medically well to be discharged, who do you need to speak to about that? And it took probably about 3 or 4 weeks just to try and get to the right person. And we'd be told, oh yeah, she's going to be, you know, she's ready for discharge, or what does that look like? How do you? And my mum is obviously not able to engage with the people. Yeah. If it was somebody who's mentally well, they'd be able to engage with the doctor potentially, or engage with the nurses, and then feed back to the family. But for us as a family, trying to manage that externally, it was challenging. And I think there's a lot of situations like that where it's just not well enough explained how you need to engage with the system.
Well, especially when you've got someone who, you know, isn't able to take all the information that a doctor's gonna, you know, speak to her about. Yeah. You know, she's not gonna retain it. She's not able to potentially offer an opinion to it, because it's not, you know, depending on the level of dementia at that point. And I think, how can they better serve those individuals and the families, and have that better communication so that you're able to get all the information you need. You don't need to try and run around and ask all those questions, because it makes an already difficult situation even more difficult and challenging, because you're constantly trying to like figure out and search out information. I think that's just it's sad to hear that.
We came across a lot of groups because we wanted to talk to everyone who's in and around the community of dementia support, and a lot of what we found was actually formal and informal groups of informal carers. So people like in your situation tended to be husbands and wives, so a bit older, but they would be sort of meeting semi-regularly, like once a month, and I think a lot of people got a lot out of that. Both on the practical side of they're on different stages of the journey, or someone's been through that and they might know something or know a group or have heard of Sedgemoor earlier, but also on the emotional support side. It sounds like you've got a good family around you with all your brothers and all that support. Have you ever spoken to any other like informal carers or people who've been on the dementia journey for any reason? Or
not huge amounts. We've had conversations with friends we know who've been through it, and I think that's probably what's a bit different about our circumstance, or for people where both parents have got dementia, is a lot of the support groups are set up with the assumption that one person doesn't have dementia, the other one does, and then there's that support. Whereas for us, we just haven't got the capacity necessarily to go to different support groups with our parents, or to engage in quite the same way as you might if it was your husband or your wife.
Makes sense.
So I think that just it's just a different aspect to the situation.
Because these meetups, that was 11 a.m. on a Tuesday in a garden centre.
Yeah, that's right.
So you're probably not able at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday to go to a garden centre in the
sounds great.
It'd be nice if you had the time to.
It's so interesting though, isn't it, that that it's set up that way, that it's with that assumption that someone in that potentially in that relationship, if there is a relationship, doesn't have dementia.
Because it can be a trigger, social isolation, loneliness. It must happen to someone where the spouse has died as well, where they end up with dementia.
Absolutely.
So there must be actually quite a lot of people in your situation where maybe there isn't, the right amount of support for the informal care. But I think that's the global cost of dementia is like 1.3 trillion, and I think half of that's attributed to the cost on the informal carers like yourself, in terms of hours lost working,
time
or actual costs that you incur during the journey, which is just mad. So thinking about like other aspects of your journey and things, thinking about like any misconceptions about dementia, maybe stuff that you thought beforehand and now having lived through it, do you think there's any like misconceptions about what the journey's like from your perspective?
I think, I don't know about necessarily misconceptions, but I think an observation from our experiences, it just presents really differently in my mum and dad. So I guess I would have historically thought of dementia as being, generally speaking, the same thing. For people start forgetting things and then forget things a bit more, and then whereas for my mum and dad present very differently, and my sort of step grandmother as well has dementia, and again very different presentation. And so for my mum, she's very much in the moment, even just moving into the nursing home. She doesn't really seem to have twigged that she's in a different environment now, but she's just in the moment. You can engage with her in the moment. Not everything makes sense, but it's, she's generally fairly happy in the moment. Whereas for my dad, he's more, aware of situations, forgetful, but his logic process seems to have gone, so you can't really have a logical discussion with him about situations or what's happening, because you talk about a fact and then try to build on that fact to something else. It's just like, it just doesn't work. It's hard to describe it really, but it's just been really interesting to see very different ways that the disease develops. So that's probably the biggest thing for me, where I've just observed that's quite, and I think that's true. There's lots of different ways that dementia can can present.
Because they said there's like hundreds of types of dementia.
Yes.
And that's probably why it presents in different ways, which just shows how complex the whole journey is. I think that's why we're doing the podcast, because as us come into it as lay people, Adam, my co-founder, had been on the journey and seen it first hand. But then as we get and meet more families, it's just like it's almost unique every time in terms of how they present, what support you need when, how quickly it progresses, all those types of things. And that was another reason why we wanted to think about doing the podcast was, and I know we talked about it, where prevention, obviously both parents have got dementia. I don't think is there a lot of genetic?
There's genetic markers that make you more, I don't think it guarantees that you'll get dementia, but it makes you more likely to get it, more susceptible to it. So one of my brothers has had that test and does have that genetic marker. I've not had it, and I don't know if I will do, because I don't think it really changes a huge amount necessarily right now. But for me, a few years ago, I started to get a lot more interested in prevention, because I just had that thought, both parents have got dementia. I really want to try and do what I can to.
It does make you think, doesn't it? Like, what can you do to make sure that, or put things that you can put in place in your everyday, whether it's just mental health well-being or sleep, making sure that you get enough, And I think it's thinking about that and having the conversations that, again, as you said, like with the podcast, to kind of talk about prevention, so that just brings a bit more awareness to it. Does it make you think about it more and more and more now?
Yeah, I changed a lot, and I think one of the things that made me nervous as well is probably before. It wasn't COVID related; it was before COVID. But I started, I think, partly just the business of our lives. We've got 5 boys, and life is pretty busy anyway. But I was just finding a lot of the evenings I just felt like I had this brain fog, and I think combination of that and both parents having dementia, I was starting to get quite concerned about, is this the start of a path? So I started to look a lot more into what I could do to try and minimise the risk, or try and improve things, and change my diet quite a bit. I listen to quite a lot of podcasts anyway, and listened to a really interesting one. There's a guy called Dr. Rangan Chatterjee, who does a podcast called Feel Better, Live More, I think it is. And he interviewed someone a few years ago who did a lot of research into gut and brain links, and how what you eat can really impact your brain health. And she had a top five things that you should be eating to help your brain
tell us, and
health.
have to go to the shop afterwards.
I'll probably forget them now, but water is the biggest thing, like staying hydrated. Okay. That was number 1. Number 2 was fatty fish or caviar. Caviar, because caviar is or fish eggs, very concentrated versions of what you get in salmon or. But she said, even just tinned salmon, tinned anchovies, things like that, eating on a regular basis. Berries was another one. Berries, dark green, leafy veg. And then the last one, I'm going to forget. There's one more that I'll come back to in a second, but I started to, olive oil, that was the other one.
Oh, right.
So extra virgin olive oil.
Well done, must be working, you've remembered all 5.
Yeah. If you'd asked me a few years ago, I'd have forgotten all those. But yeah, I started to try and incorporate those into my diet make sure I was having that on a regular basis. And then just as time goes on, and it's like with the news feed, as soon as you start showing interest in stuff like that, you get fed more and more. Yeah. And then I've kept an eye on the research that's out there as well. But a lot of the stuff that's good for your brain is good for your health generally. So, nutrition-wise, there's a lot of stuff that's helpful, like we just talked about. Exercise, sleep, reducing alcohol. But I think what I found is not being too worried about trying to do too much too quickly. I think if you just change, change a little bit each time, just add something into your diet. See if it works for you. If it doesn't, then try something else. But I really noticed within probably 6 months to a year, I started to feel that the brain fog was lifting, and I'd say I feel healthier mentally, significantly healthier mentally now than I did 3 or 4 years ago, just in terms of being able to process stuff properly again.
That's great.
It was quite a weird experience. Quite scary for me because it's not like my brain had turned off, but I just felt like I wasn't able to really think things through in the way that I had been previously.
Brain fog's real though, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll put a link to that episode you mentioned in the show notes, so everyone else can go and have a listen, especially on the diet. And I think that's what part of the reason why we wanted to do the podcast, is to give people a nice place where they can learn about all this stuff, whether it's prevention, whether it's dealing with things. And that's why you'll be the presenter, because you'll get to ask questions having been on the journey. Yeah, and you're also interested. Yeah, exactly, for both prevention and for dealing with your what you've had to deal with your mum and dad. We're going to try and do this with all the guests, so we might as well do it with you as well, even though you'll be presenter. Is like one sort of key takeaway or piece of advice, for people listening, whether it's to do with prevention or driving hope. It just actually in terms of driving hope, we got this little mug that we did for carers, because we work a lot with carers in the social care organisations, and they loved this quote, which was, "The everyday hero turns empathy into action, navigating the emotional roller coaster of caregiving with grace, patience, and the occasional humorous distraction." Yeah. So, is there any like a piece of advice or any hope that you found in the journey that you could share with the listeners?
Yeah, I'll do both of those. So one piece of advice would be power of attorney.
Right.
We're not talked about that, but it's made a huge difference to us. We got power of attorney sorted out for mum and dad several years ago for both. There's two types that you need to get. One is for health and welfare, I think it is, and the other one is for finance. And it just means that at the point where you need to exercise that, like my brother manages my parents' bank accounts now, and I'm able to make decisions, discuss with the health professionals and make decisions on behalf of mum and dad, and demonstrate that I've got the legal authority to do that. If you haven't done that, we've got a friend who didn't have power of attorney, and whose mum has dementia, and he's having to now, you then have to go to court to get guardianship, and it's a much, much more complicated procedure. So it's relatively easy to do the power of attorney with the government's online system. So I would say, whether or not you've got any thoughts of dementia being an issue, even if you've got parents that are, I'm about to turn 50, so I've just realised, but I was about to say 50 and above. You got parents that are getting on a little bit, I just get that sorted, because you don't exercise it until it's needed, but if you've got it there, it makes a huge difference practically. And then on the positive side, I think you just got to really focus on the positive moments. So like with my mum, like our whole relationship with her has changed from what it was. And there's an extended grieving process, I think. I think a lot of people will say, at the point when their relatives with dementia die, often they've done the grieving by that point, and it's almost a relief. But at the same time, there's loads of positive moments. Like my mum just takes a huge amount of joy in really simple things like the sky and the colours of the trees, or and she's still quite funny. You can have a little joke with it. So just taking joy in those in the moment, I think, is really important as well, to appreciate them for who they are right now and the relationship you've got with them right now. Alongside recognising it's changed from what it was, but you can still get joy in that. And the other piece, I think, as well, is really recognising and being grateful for the people that do help. Their friends, although it's been a bit challenging at times, sort of dealing with their expectations, just recognising that it's because they love my mum and dad and they want what's really good for them, and they love us as a family, and they've been massively supportive in loads of different ways. All the people that interact with them and help with them as well. I mean, there's a huge amount of positive support out there. People do really want to help, although there's things that could be improved. There's a massive amount of positive support out there. So I think recognising that as well, and not, it's easy to get taken up by the negatives, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh,
such a lovely way to wrap up the podcast, isn't it? Like the first episode, I think, power of attorney is definitely great advice, but then focusing on those positive moments and being in that moment with your loved one.
Yeah.
I think you can't beat it.
Yeah.
And, you know, you can take so much from those moments. So, no, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing your story, because obviously it's difficult, isn't it? But yeah, it's been great.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. Yeah, thanks for listening.